on giving you food on a daily basis becomes your enemy because you lose the instinct to cook. The question that is then on the table, when I stop talking about the rivers, look at the Great Lakes. And ladies and gentlemen, particularly you and me of African extraction, we should be very annoyed with ourselves. Why? Look at the Great Lakes. They are only great in name. But they are not great for what they give us in terms of the use and resources. These are freshwater lakes. We now know that you can generate power through waves. What are we doing with them? What are we doing with Lake Victoria, which is now heavily polluted? What are we doing with Lake Albert? And I hope the Ugandans, when they start extracting oil, will not pollute Lake. I hate calling it Albert. You must get a proper name, Ugandans. Lake, what we now call Albert and Edward. By next year, you must change the names of those lakes. What can be done in terms of ensuring that those resources are used? You go down to what we now call the Victoria Falls. It's Mosio Tunya Falls. And see what can be used to generate those things at the Mosio Tunya. And I'm saying that when we talk about the economic use and value of all these, and those of you and many of you here come from River Basin. Look at the Orange now. What cannot be done in the Orange? I know the South Africans and the people from Lesotho, you are now happy. Water is still coming from Lesotho, from the islands, and going to South Africa. But in 20 years, will that water be there? If we don't manage water, will it be there? This Lake Victoria, it's what, when I grew up along the shores of Lake Victoria, we could drink directly from the lake. Today, unless you are suicidal, you will not take water from the lake. And in the rooms where you are given bottled waters, perhaps Dasani, made by Coca-Cola in Atlanta, Georgia. I think you must have felt ashamed. This is what we are talking about in terms of the economic impact and the possibilities that are there when we talk about river basins. My fear is this, that in the continent of Africa, we are incapable of understanding and appreciating the possible economic impact. I hear estimates that are being given about what would happen if we exploited our river basins and our water resources properly, and they are conservatively talking about 200 billion. Wrong. It is in the trillions. It is in the trillions. Right now, just look at the Nile. Look at what is being done at the Grand Renaissance Dam. Look at the power that is going to be generated there. 10,000 megawatts at the very least. I'm talking about hydroelectric power. Look at the industries that it can spur. Leather, manufacturing, food, irrigation in agriculture. What can it not do? We are now in the era of the 4th industrial revolution and the 5th industrial revolution. You'll need power. If you don't have power, then is a pipe dream. Power, energy is the key thing. And water is going to be the thing that is going to give us sustainable energy. And I'm saying that the Nile Valley can achieve it. But what must we do in order to ensure that we have good diplomacy? Because what we now have is what I call gunboat diplomacy. The Ethiopians are now not talking with the Egyptians because the dam is almost 90% complete. The Ethiopians say we are going to start filling the dam. The Egyptians say, you fill it, we'll see. And on 19th, the Egyptians now stopped being African, they became Arabs. They attended a meeting of the Arab League, and the Arab League has now said that they will not allow the dam to be filled as they watch. What are we being told? That if push comes to shove, we will not hesitate to use force. That is what we are being told. And don't imagine that it cannot happen. Don't imagine that it cannot happen. It can happen. Can we stop it? Yes, we can. Under the aegis of the African Union and under the aegis of the Nile Valley Basin, there is a need for urgent and important diplomacy that allows the members of the Nile Basin to ask ourselves, this is a shared resource, this Nile. It is good for all of us. You Ethiopians generate power, but be mindful of Sudan. Be mindful of Egypt. Be mindful of South Sudan. Be mindful of Lake Turkana, because the damming of the Grand Renaissance Dam is also affecting Lake Turkana in Kenya, which is becoming more and more saline because the aquifers are not now, they are not being charged. So there is a need for a conversation between Kenya and Ethiopia, as indeed with all else. But do I see such conversations taking place in a proper manner? I don't. You will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't. What I see is we move from treaty to protocol to declaration, from workshop to symposia to colloquia without any positive movement. The time is now to put a stop to this declaration, to put a stop to workshops, to put a stop to symposia, to put a stop to colloquia, and to enter into constructive engagement which is time-bound. We cannot afford the luxury of generating heat without producing light. This is what we must do in the Nile Valley. And that conversation is also necessary around all the other river basins. There must be an understanding that transboundary resources, when in 1963, 32 heads of states gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, as they are beginning to do today, 60 years ago. Then they met on 24th. Then they met on the 25th. One of the things that was discussed there was whether we should redraw inherited colonial boundaries. And there were two arguments, perhaps three, perhaps four, because I can begin to hear Emperor Haile Selassie speaking about it, was the host. That we should, even on the basis of these inherited boundaries, create an environment where we will use our common and shared resources for the benefit of the entire Africa. I can hear Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere saying the same thing. I can hear the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah saying, if we begin to redraw boundaries, where will we stop? And I can hear Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, because the Aswan High Dam had then been built, saying we should not redraw the inherited colonial boundaries, but we should not use them to stop us from enjoying shared resources. That is how the doctrine of the inviolability of inherited boundaries was initiated in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963 and adopted at the meeting in Cairo in 1964. Today, we are fighting about boundaries, about hills and molehills, and killing each other, about shared resources. We must stop. We must only see those boundaries as useful for purposes of administration. Easier said than done, but it can be done. And those of you who are in the Nile Basin, this is the kind of diplomacy that I want to see you articulating and escalating to the head of states and heads of government in our region. There is no shortage of writing that has been undertaken in this particular area. There is no shortage of expertise, and some of you are dyed-in-the-wool experts in this arena. That is the Nile Valley. Let us go to the Congo Basin. If you look at the Congo Basin, you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and the other possible beneficiaries like Central African Republic, the Congo Brazzaville, you go even down to Zambia. Look at what the Congo cannot do, even to Angola. Because these are interconnected. You go to Okavango down there. You go to Kariba. You go down there to Zambezi. What cannot be done in terms of creating waterways? Those of you, I see my friends from the other part of the world, hopefully from Europe and the United States of America. If they are from Europe, they'll be familiar with the Rhine Valley. Look at what the Rhine Valley has done in terms of communication and in terms of watering those areas. Even if you go to the United Kingdom, which doesn't have very little, although they call themselves great, they don't have very much. But look at their little river called the River Thames. Do you know that that River Thames was at one time like a sewage? Then they cleaned it up. We can do that to our less polluted rivers. And they can be the fountain of economic activity. They can be the fountain of agriculture, so that we stop depending on rain-fed agriculture. But the constant theme is this: shared resources. I remember that great man, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, otherwise known as the Mahatma, saying, there is enough for everybody's needs, but there is not enough for anybody's greed. And in many ways, the waters that we are talking about can be shared. But we are greedy and arrogant and egotistical. And because of that, we don't share. If you go to what is now dominating African jurisprudential discourse called Ubuntu, I am because we are. Suppose we were to say that what is going to govern the use of river basin resources in Africa is Ubuntu. Would any country not enjoy those resources? Wouldn't Uganda agree with Egypt that during any 1 year we are going to use this volume of water for purposes of irrigation? Would the Ethiopians not agree that we wanted to fill the dam in 4 years? We know it will harm you, Sudan and South Sudan and Egypt. We are not therefore going to fill it over a period of 8 years. Wouldn't that happen? And if we did, wouldn't we be all richer in the context of Africa Agenda 2063? Wouldn't we be all richer in the context of Africa Continental Free Trade Area, so that the cotton and soya beans that is grown in Egypt will now move down through tariff and non-tariff barriers? Wouldn't the matoke grown here in Uganda not find its way to Tanzania? Would the onions grown in Tanzania not find their way to Democratic Republic of Congo? In the Western African, wouldn't the cocoa being grown in Togo and La Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana not find themselves in Liberia and Senegal? In Nigeria, if we use the resources properly, wouldn't the cows that are now grazing in the streets of Abuja not find themselves up in the north with water having been dammed, as Muammar al-Gaddafi tried to do? And down south, wouldn't we discover that the Zambezi can be done and the Okavango and the Orange Free can be done so that there is no shortage of water in Cape Town? Can it not be done? And these are practical things. We are not engaged here in what one calls rocket science, but even rocket science is no longer an arcane science. It is here with us. And we are saying that the task, therefore, is ours. You know, when I talk to you here, it's like preaching to the choir. You listen to this sermon so often, but yet it must be repeated to you. Because what is clear must be made even clearer. And that is what we are doing. What one therefore is saying, go to your respective areas and ask ourselves, why are we engaged in this treadmill kind of activity where there is motion without movement? And we are saying that it must be done. And it can be done. And I am also suggesting to us that within the continent of Africa, we must now begin to do what is happening. But Europe has been very good at this because they started using their waterways a long time ago. Therefore, the issue of damming and canalization of rivers and its use for diverse areas is something that is well developed. Africa, in many ways, is still virgin in this regard. What do I see when I look at the crystal ball? So that we may engage in a conversation rather than a monologue. When I look at the crystal ball, what do I see? I see economic opportunities. I see economic opportunities in agriculture through irrigation, through targeted irrigation, not the kind of irrigation that there is wastage of water. See what the Israelis are doing through hydroponic agriculture and targeted irrigation, where a plant only receives what it needs. So the fears of Egypt are misplaced. We'll use artificial intelligence so the plant tells us, I need only 2 liters, and it receives only 2 liters. You don't spend 10 liters and while it needs 10. I see opportunities in agriculture. And what is good when our agriculture improves? It improves our health. The health burden reduces. We then become more reliant on ourselves and we don't look to Ukraine and Russia. I see opportunities in navigation. In terms of movement, the navigable waters can be used for purposes of navigation. I see opportunities in non-navigational uses of these rivers. Generation of power through hydroelectric power and through waves. I see opportunities in fishing, which is agriculture. I see opportunities in aquaculture. I see opportunities in terms of provision of potable water. One of the things that we must try to do and do very seriously is to try and liberate ourselves from water domination. If you do not know it, we are now beginning to be water dominated. The greatest suppliers of bottled water in Africa today are Nestle of Switzerland and Coca-Cola of Atlanta, Georgia. If you did not know now. So that you and me who are in the middle class, in our refrigerators there is water which we do not own. You are drinking water from Atlanta, Georgia. We can use our water to do that. I see all those opportunities. And how do I see those opportunities helping the continent of Africa? I see those opportunities helping the continent of Africa if we engage in transboundary conversations. Africa now has many conflicts which stand in the path of the use of our water resources. As I speak to you now, the Nile Valley is in danger because there is conflict in Sudan, which if left unchecked could degenerate into a civil war. Will it not impact the use of the Nile? If there is a rogue regime in Sudan, will you be able to control whether they are polluting the river or not? As I speak to you now, how many dead bodies are being thrown into the river Nile? As I speak to you now. As I speak to you now, courtesy of the activities of Boko Haram, how many dead bodies are being thrown into the Niger and the Chad River? And it's getting into our food chain. Conflicts must be resolved. Therefore, as I conclude, I am saying that all these resources that are given to us, courtesy of nature and God, the rivers and the water resources in the continent of Africa, in my view, if we utilize them properly, will be the lifeblood and the engine at once of Africa's economic and therefore industrial growth. We are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution and the fifth industrial revolution, which talks about artificial intelligence and quantum computing, which can be used to help us manage water resources even better. We are talking about Africa Agenda 2063. We are talking about Sustainable Development Goals. We are talking about Africa Continental Free Trade Area. All these things cannot survive without water, ladies and gentlemen. Water is the lifeblood of human development. And I remember when God was creating the world, I was not there, but I read. One of his divine instructions was, "Go ye and subdue the world." Our duty is to subdue our river resources so that they are able to help us. It is still true that those who seek never fail to find. Let us seek through our rivers, riverbeds, our sources, our oceans, and this continent may sooner rather than later realize what she deserves: socio-economic development, political stability, and industrialization. God bless you. You'll be familiar with the initiatives in 2010 that involved Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, and I think Burundi again joined in the year 2011. But are the Egyptians who opposed it? The Egyptians opposed it, as did the Sudanese. At that time, South Sudan had not been born and therefore was a part of Sudan. These are the things that I'm putting on the table for you, that you may wrap your minds around them as you talk about the river basin. But we are only talking about the Nile, and I'll come back to the Nile a little later. If we go down to West Africa and we go around the Chad basin, in the last 20 years, I think Lake Chad has shrunk by more than 30%, if not more, with the consequence that the fisher population in that area are completely devastated. When you see what is happening there, the loss of the discharge of the aquifers under that particular area have suffered in a tremendous way. How are we using the Niger? How have the waters of the Niger been affected by the very reckless extraction of oil in that area? If you go to the Bakassi Peninsula, and if you go out there, you go into the Mano River, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and those countries in that particular area. You go to the Senegambia area. How are we using those waters for the economic benefit of the continent of Africa? We are talking about the unraveling of the Sahara Desert, and we are saying we should arrest the desert. Are we using those resources for purpose of ensuring that we address that particular issue, particularly in these days of climate change? When we go to the Congo River Basin, and you know the Congo River is amazing. The Congo River may not be as navigable as it should be. I remember when we were young, when they were teaching us geography, they used to tell us about there was a song about which rivers are navigable. And we used to sing that River Congo is not navigable. We know that across the Congo it is navigable. But the navigability of the River Congo, which is the conduit of transport between Kinshasa and Brazzaville, is a fountain of economic activity. But that is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the opportunities that it presents for purposes of ensuring that there is economic activity. If you are to dam the Congo River all the way and do it properly across to the Atlantic, you can imagine what it would do. in the manner, for example, that the Germans have dealt with the Rhine River. If we could do that with the Congo River, you can imagine what would happen in that basin that we are talking about. And if you go beyond, and when I talk about the Congo River, I'm also talking about the possibilities such as hydroelectric power. It is estimated that the Grand Inga Dam, if Inga Dam were to be constructed, Inga Dam would contribute to our grids anything between 100 and 150 megawatts. That is more than the installed capacity of hydroelectric in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. And you imagine what that would do to industries. Because if you look at Africa today in terms of power generation, and you cannot begin to talk industrialization without power. Look at the installed capacity of power across the continent of Africa, and you start. Nigeria, 5,000 megawatts, that is generation. Distribution could be anything between 3,000 and 3,500. Ghana, 2,500. Liberia, 500. Sierra Leone, 500. Guinea-Bissau, about 400. Benin, 550. And if you go to Mali, it's anything between 300 and 600. You go to La Côte d'Ivoire, slightly over 2,500. The Gambia, less than 1,000. Senegal, less than 3,000. That is the power we are talking about. That is not power that you can use to industrialize. I keep on saying, of course, this is hyperbolic and exaggerating, that perhaps the power they use at the Schiphol airport is more than the entire amount of power generated in Guinea-Bissau. And I'm saying this in seriousness and in jest, because you cannot talk about industrialization without power. And I'm saying that these river basins lend themselves to modular power generation in terms of hydro capacity. And if you leave the western coast of Africa and you go down, you come to the eastern part of Africa and look at the little river that we have. In Kenya, only look at the Tana. And you go to Tanzania, look at the Rufiji. And those others, and I'm happy that the Tanzanians are now beginning to use the Mwalimu Nyerere, Kambarage Nyerere hydroelectric power, which is being done by the Egyptians, and is going to generate anything between 2,000 and 3,000. You are beginning to talk industrialization. You go to Rufiji, you are beginning to see what is happening in that area. You go to Ghana, you talk Volta, you are beginning to see. You go down in Zambia, you are talking about Kariba. You are talking Zambezi. And during the last drought, you saw what happened when the Kariba was dry and the power outage. Those of you who come from South Africa will be familiar with what is happening right now in terms of power provision. You have power outage sometimes almost 8 hours a day when you are on level 6. Those of you who come from Ghana will be familiar with the vocabulary that the Ghanaians gave to the world called Dumso, Dumso. Of course, they have now solved it. And one is saying that all these river resources are there and they can be exploited. Live transmission being subtitled through the Chinese media called the CGTN. 6,000 Chinese leaders were meeting in Beijing. And they were discussing the future of China 100 years from thence. It means that none of them would be alive. But they are thinking about 100 years. Then they break it down into 5, into 10, as each generation goes through it. Today, there is not a single African country, and those of you who travel, and I travel across this continent, you'll always meet at least 3 young Chinese between the ages of 20 and 30, sometimes going to Kaduna in Nigeria, Swakopmund in Namibia, Nampula in Mozambique. I've met them. And I get into a conversation with them. One I met in Nairobi, Kenya, he told me he had been in the Delta region in Nigeria for 3 years. He's 27 and he'd been in Kenya for 4 years. I asked, but when did you come? How old were you? He said, I was 21. Now, when that gentleman is 50, he knows Africa more than all of us combined.
That's true.
Thinking, strategic thinking. And indeed, even if you look at the colonial project, it was strategic thinking. These people you hear like Speak or Stanley, they were in their 20s. But your typical African, if he's in Kampala here and you tell him to go to Hoima, he says that is hardship area. Hoima here. Or Gulu, he thinks it's hardship area. And somebody has come all the way from Germany, from the comfort of Cologne, and is in Marsabit. We must change. I sat down with a friend of mine who used to be the former president of Tanzania, John Joseph Pombe Magufuli, and he told me he attended 2 meetings. International, then he said he stopped attending those meetings. Because they keep on saying the same thing. Number one, your ministers come to you with speeches that they've already written. You meet the speech, and I'm using the word meet deliberately. You meet the speech on the podium, written in big print, then you read it, and then they take it away. Then you wait for another meeting. That is not transformation. Has Africa ever gone into a space of transformation? Are African countries doing that? Yes, there are countries that are doing that. If you look at the activities of the Ugandan president in the first 10 years, hear me clearly, transformation, moving the country in the right direction. Look at Mugabe, first 10 years in Zimbabwe, direction. Look at Rwanda. Look at Botswana, Serese Kama. Look at Tanzania. Look at Abdel Nasser, the first few years. This is when the big dams were being done. Look at Kaunda when Kariba was being done. Look at Samora Machel when he was talking about Nkomad. Look at Nkrumah with the Volta. I'm giving you these examples that you may not know. You may know that there are indeed men and women who think right. You all think right. Your problem is that you are operating in environments where there is toxic politics, where the politician is not thinking like the Chinese intergenerationally. They are thinking about the next elections. When you are always thinking about the next elections, you cannot transform anything. The only thing you can transform is your stomach. That is the problem of Africa. Right now, here in Uganda, and I say these things boldly because we must say things boldly. Ugandans are talking about elections in 2026. Kenyans are talking about elections in 2027. We just held elections 9 months ago. We are already making formation for 2027. When do we think about the Nile Valley or the Lake Basin Development Authority? How can we, my good friend from, how can we possibly think? We are thinking about raising money for the next election. We are not thinking about changing villages. My home, my rural home is across the lake from Lake Victoria. As I speak to you now, there is not a single water project running in my village of 60,000 people. GIZ and all these other Western bodies which intend to help us are there. But you're also getting fatigued. And I hope and pray you get fatigued. Perhaps that is what will open our eyes. And I'll give you an example when I talk about, I'm mixing the transformation and the question of under-resource. I'll give you a good example which has nothing to do with this. In the year 2001, African governments met in Abuja in Nigeria and said that they were going to dedicate 15% of their national budget to health. And you know, when you talk health, you are talking water. You are talking about potable water. You are talking about the water that is being consumed in order to eliminate bilharzia, in order to eliminate all these things. Not a single African country did 15%. Tanzania, Rwanda, and Mauritius went up to 10%. During that period, if you look at the money that was taken outside of the continent of Africa to Panama and Guernsey and Switzerland, it could finance all those things. Our priorities are wrong in Africa. They are wrong, and therefore we don't look at the thing that we ought to look at. The Lake Victoria Basin. I remember I used to be an active member of a group of people called the Friends of Lake Victoria, or Cienala, whom you must know. It died. Perhaps it is in comatose, waiting to be resuscitated. But why did it die, or why is it in comatose? Because they were dependent on donor funding. So the donor will fund you year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, buy you V8 and other things. And then at one time somebody said around Lake Victoria there were more V8s than there were mosquitoes. That of course is hyperbolic. But what he was saying, that there were so many of these NGO V8s running around Lake Victoria, but nothing was being done. And what happens with many African governments, as long as they factor donor funding into their national budgets, the money does not go to something else. It goes to people's pockets. That is the reality. And Lake Victoria Basin that you've talked about is, I mean, in terms of the economic opportunities that it has, you may not know, but in my rural home, if you go to Kisumu, we are importing fish from China. Fish, tilapia, from China. Can you believe it? The Chinese are growing things that look like fish. We don't know whether they are fish. They have the likeness of fish. And we are eating them gleefully. Yet this lake can produce fish to feed the entire sub-Saharan Africa. Lake Victoria Basin alone. And those of you who are there, because it's a part of the Nile Basin system, those of you who are there know what aquaculture can do. Right now there are cages all over. The effect of the cages in terms of pollution, I do not know. But do you know where we are importing fish feed? From Brazil. How should we be importing fish feed from Brazil? What is fish feed? Soya. Soya, which we can grow around the Yala Basin. So when you look at this thing, sometimes when I look at our, and don't be afraid, gentlemen, because I know politicians that are at the head of it, but you cannot talk about sin without mentioning Satan. So the problem of Africa is poor quality political leadership. And until the day that we solve that, we are going nowhere. Let you not be cheated. Writing a book in 1983, guys, Nigeria's Chinua Achebe, in the book The Trouble with Nigeria, says the problem of Nigeria, and I dare say by extension the problem of Africa, is simply and squarely a problem of political leadership. Nothing else. Because where there is political leadership, you see development. Look at Mauritius. What does Mauritius have? Nothing. They closed 4 of their sugar factories. Today, Mauritius has a GDP per capita that is larger than the entire continent of Africa. Yes. Why? Leadership, prioritization, what to do. What Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore used to say, MPC, meritocracy. Have your best men and women presiding over your affairs. Pragmatism. Get what you want. If you want a rat coat, don't care whether the cat is black or white. Honesty. Have your best men and women. But what have we given premium to in Africa? Mediocrity. In fact, in Africa, mediocrity is a badge of honor. The more mediocre you are, the farther you rise. And when that is what you do, then when we come to the budgeting aspects of it, resources will be misallocated. Very good friends of mine, GIZ is very present in Africa today, doing useful things. doing useful things. But I told just to tell you how sustainability is also very important. You can give us money year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, but year 5 you begin to wonder, these people that we are helping, they must continue to be in economic diapers. They don't grow. They are stunted in their growth and in their thinking. Then in year 6 you say, we are going back to Bonn. You who are in the development partnership arrangement must also, when you come to Africa, have an exit plan. You come in year 1 and tell the people we are leaving in year 5, and you don't revise it. Because with the mistake you do, in year 5 the politicians come to you and say, you know, now just continue for a little longer, particularly when the elections are near. Refuse. Because it is only that way that you'll help us. A neighbor who keeps on giving you food on a daily basis becomes your enemy, because you lose the instinct to cook. So there must be a point in time said, I'll give you food for 10 days, but in the 11th, please, learn how to cook. We are under-resourced because of resource allocation. On the 19th of May, I was in Kigali, Rwanda, and had the opportunity after a long time of meeting the chair of the Africa Commission, Musa Faki, and I told him, how can it be that the African Union is 60 to 70% funded by Western NGOs? How is it an African Union? And he told me the same thing. My members don't contribute. They don't contribute. But see how much money they spend in political rallies. Do I blame them? Yes. Who else do I blame? The African voter. You blame the windmill and you blame the wind. So we Africans must style up. It is only then that they'll be under-resourced. Otherwise, you'll have these empty bodies in the Lake Victoria Basin, which only do two things. Many of these organizations, the only thing that is happening is that salaries are being paid. Beyond salaries, there is no development. So, misallocation of resources because of poor politics. Okavango, time-bound. Once again, these things must be time-bound. Africa Water Vision 2025. You know, when we started saying that, you and me, the situation has actually become worse. So 2025 is 2 years away, and the water situation in Africa is becoming worse. He's just said it. Is there anything that we are doing about it? No. Are there targets? Look at SDG number 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Look at the African aspirations, of the 7 aspirations, what we are targeting. Our things are not time-bound. And once again, let me tell you, poor politics. Poor politics. As long as we don't fix the problem of politics, both with a capital P and with a small p, we are going nowhere. And it is you and me who are the problem. Somebody comes and is the president is beginning to look at his tribesmen. Nepotism and ethnicity is the bane of Africa. Our best men and women are not serving our continent. They are serving other continents. That is our problem. So how can we have anything time-bound? No. Development in the mind of your typical African politician is meant to be a mirage. The nearer you get to it, the farther it moves. That is what justifies their claim that I must not leave office because I'm the catcher of the mirage. Which he never catches. What must we do, you who are frustrated in these bodies? We must keep up at it, in the hope that one day the wax in their ears will melt and the scales in their eyes will fall. Has it happened? Yes. Mauritius, I've already given you an example. Your own Botswana. Don't think that Botswana, do you know when Bechuanaland regained our political independence, what you had? Zero. Zero. Then you entered, Seretse Khama entered into an arrangement with the De Beers, a bad arrangement, but it brought you something. then the country grew, which means it can be done. Look at your puller. Don't undersell your country. I know you are now negotiating about your gold, and I think you are going to enter into a very bad arrangement. Tell President Musisi. It cannot be 20%, it should be 60%.
Yes.
And then within the next 5 years, it is 80%, then you can float 20 for other investors. Let it be 80%. So Botswana is doing a good job, despite the many problems that you have. Good job. Rwanda, good job. But I keep on telling African countries, individually we are too small. No matter how we do it, individually we must do it as a group. As a group, if you are a goat, no matter how much you eat, you can only be a fat goat. You cannot be a cow. I'm saying that if we want to eat an elephant, you can't swallow an elephant. You eat it bit by bit. So Rwanda is doing a good job in that. In Tanzania, good job, time-bound. And if you listen to the good lady, Mama Samia Suluhu Hassan, when she inherited the construction of the Mwalimu Nyerere hydroelectric dam, said,